Hey everyone, welcome to Reboot, episode 1.5, as it were. I think that's how we're going to roll with it, right?
I think so. I think that's the plan.
If you haven't yet, this episode will not make sense. Go back and watch the first episode of Reboot. It's called Resident Evil 7 Finishes What Silent Hill Started. That was the first episode of Reboot. Go watch that. For those of you who don't know, in the off weeks of that bi-weekly show, we're going to be doing this. Just a very casual kind of podcast style reflection on the last episode, teasing the next episode, but mainly, and the most important part, getting feedback from people, a lot of which we have for the episode today, this here Reboot 1.5. YouTube comments, tweets, what you thought about the first episode, what you might want to see in the next episode or a couple episodes going forward. Jake and I, as the two halves of Reboot, are really interested in hearing your thoughts, and we're depending on you to help drive the show.
Most of the comments were positive. There were a couple people who kind of had little issues with it. Thumbnail, I don't know, just little things. And then the rest of the comments were people saying, you guys relaunching Reboot, that old show?
It's like the first animated cartoon ever. It's just polygonal green people. I think it was a Canadian show.
Something like that.
I'll pull that up right now. You're kind of looking at it right now. As you can see, it's kind of creepy. It always creeped me out when I used to see it. My friend just the other day brought it up, and I was like, damn, I forget how much that show was upsetting.
But believe it or not, we didn't call this show Reboot because of that show.
Essentially, just the idea of when you finally get through games or something, or you want to kind of look at games differently, reboot how you think, I guess, something along those lines. It's punchy. But also, yeah, a lot of people mentioned it's got Danny O'Dwyer flavor. If you're a longtime GameSpot fan or the Point fan, you probably noticed this feels like the Point, and that's where we got the inspiration. When Danny left, we didn't really have that editorial opinion show, and now, obviously, we've been watching his stuff, Jake and I, for years now.
And we're not trying to hide the fact that we are taking a lot of inspiration from Danny. I think that would be, both of us have watched his stuff for a long time, and I think it is a definite inspiration. But we also are trying to put our own flavor on it, and I think this is kind of how we're trying to do it with this sort of 1.5 episode. And plus, obviously, my opinion is different from Danny's. Mike's opinion is different from Danny's. So, yes, it follows a similar format, and we'll be the first to admit that, but we're hoping we can do something a little different, and that might take a little longer than we expect, but we hope we're headed down that direction now.
Anyway, so we do have comments. Thanks so much for getting your comments into YouTube. Like I said, we'll feature you. We'll call you out, whether you tweet at us or you comment on the YouTube video. We're focusing on YouTube. We do have the video on site, and we'll go through those eventually. But oddly enough, we were looking through, and YouTube, of all places, was very positive reception.
Yeah, so the first one we're looking at is by Bo Viper on YouTube. I think that's how you pronounce it. Michael Mahardy, I was surprised you left out Outlast, including the new one, and BioShock when discussing survival horror. Still an awesome video. Do you think the rise of YouTubers and streamers playing games with tons of jump scares has influenced how devs are shaping the genre?
Yeah, so that was actually, I think the video was originally 20 seconds longer because we mentioned Alien Isolation, we mentioned Outlast. I might have touched on BioShock, but I don't think so. I think I was sticking more to horror games. It became this long section in the middle, this boring section that we just talked about way too many horror games, and I just wanted to condense it into this small part about indies. And we already did a documentary series. You should watch it. It's called Reviving Resident Evil Tomorrow, and they explore how indies kept horror alive when Resident Evil declined. And we wanted to focus more on how it was continuing what Silent Hill started with this Renaissance thing. But yeah, so we were just kind of, we had to pick which horror titles we wanted to mention, and Alien Isolation and The Evil Within and Outlast were all kind of we couldn't delve too deep into them without the video getting kind of too long.
And I think you did touch on Amnesia, which kind of kicked off that sort of indie horror thing. So, obviously Outlast, it may or may not be a product of Amnesia, but Amnesia is kind of the pivotal indie game that kind of kicked off that indie horror renaissance.
Yeah. And as for Bo Viper's question, it's actually a really good question. Do you think the rise of YouTubers and streamers playing games with tons of jump scares has influenced devs? I think so, in some way. I don't know how much it's influenced into how much it carries over into the final design of their products, but they must be thinking about that when they're making games. Almost, unless you're making some sort of, I don't know, I can't think of any kind of game you would make today where you don't have the YouTube audience in mind, right? That Let's Plays are so prevalent now. It's such a ubiquitous thing to stumble across on YouTube. Horror devs must be I can't wait to see people playing through this and then getting the jump scares in. I don't know. I can't speak to whether it actually makes them put more jump scares in. I actually like Resident Evil 7 because of how little it leaned on jump scares, I thought. I think Resident Evil 7 is great because it's really good about that dread and that kind of just creepy, disturbing, underlying, like survival tinged horror rather than the jump scares. But I'd be interested to talk to horror devs about whether they're shaping their games with a YouTube audience in mind. That'd be interesting. Again, Bo Viper, thanks for getting your question in. And everybody else, look forward to your thoughts on the next episode.
This one's from Tony Zuniga. I hope I pronounced that right. Tony Zuniga 8 from YouTube. He says, one problem that occurs in many survival horror games and other horror media is the lack of a satisfying ending. Horror is best when fear comes from the unknown, but there's always a point where discoveries are made and the mystery fades away, leaving us with a bitter aftertaste. Do you feel there's a good way to end horror stories? What horror games do you feel have done endings right?
Yeah, I agree. I'd say it's weird though. Like Guillermo del Toro, he says, like, what's his quote? Always show the monster, which I always was more afraid in horror when I didn't know what the monster was. But he was a big fan, obviously, of showing it. But yeah, there's sometimes most Resident Evil games. I think Resident Evil games were always too cheesy to really scare me. It was the gameplay, the moment-to-moment gameplay of knowing there's a zombie in this room and knowing I have only one bullet left. That's what terrifies me, and that's why I like 7, because the survival comes back, and that's what adds tension to it. But I think good. I really liked Outlast, and I really liked Amnesia, and I think it was scarier when I knew there was a monster around the corner than when I could see him coming at me. And I also like the mechanic in Outlast where you're sprinting away and you can look over your shoulder and see them chasing you. That's terrifying. That kind of plays into that fear I used to have, like that phobia of running up like the basement stairs when I was a kid and something was chasing me. Did you have that, Jake?
Well, I didn't have a basement.
But do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Just that feeling that something's behind you. But yeah, I think there's a good way to end horror stories. I do like the ones that kind of leave some mystery. I don't like horror stories to make sense at the end. I think we fear what we don't understand, and if we feel like we understand it completely, then that erases some of the disturbing aspects.
Yeah, it's weird though, right? Because if you don't understand it fully, then it feels unfulfilling.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a really thin line you have to walk.
Yeah.
All right, next one. Grant Wilson on Twitter says, definitely like the style of the shoot. Mirroring the VHS tapes from Resident Evil 7 was a great idea. This actually came kind of naturally. I think Mike really wanted to do something on Resident Evil, and we were thinking like, oh, found footage would be cool, and it was just kind of seemed like a natural idea for this. It took a long time. It took a very long time to get that look down and to find spots that were scary. And actually, someone does ask Ryan O'Reilly, I think that's what it is. Ryan O'Reilly asked, where were these VO segments shot? And they were shot in a hotel, one of our friends' hotel's basement.
Yeah.
And then actually...
creepy place.
Yeah, and then actually in our garage, too.
Yeah, I used to live with Jake.
Which is somehow creepier than this.
At the time of the shoot, I lived with Jake, and our garage, it looked like there's mold growing on the walls. So, like, the last two camera shots that you see, the one where I turn out the light bulb and the one where I'm walking down this hallway toward him, that's our basement. / garage. Jake found, like, 8 layers for this filter that made it look that way, and then, yeah, like Jake said, the rest came naturally. Just the muffled audio on my camera segments, the static shocks out of nowhere, the rewinds. We're going to try to do that as often as possible with this series. Like, when it makes sense, try to aim for an aesthetic that fits what we're talking about. And I think this was, like, the perfect way to kick that off.
For Breath of the Wild, Mike's going to get electrocuted by lightning while on it. Yeah.
You just tease our next episode? We'll get to it.
Maybe I did.
I'll get electrocuted. Yeah, I'll wear a green tunic, and we could shoot it in the woods or something. All right, we're jumping the gun on this one.
King Zelos on YouTube says, this is fantastic work, not too long, but informative and concise. As for what you guys should do next, I think you should do a Legend of Zelda reboot. Is a no-brainer. I can't read. With the release of Breath of the Wild and how much that title changes the franchise, it would make for a great episode. Looking forward to more of these. I'm going to make this bigger.
Okay. Well,
I kind of spoiled
King
it
Zelos,
just a second ago.
As it happens, I'm in the middle of... So, again, we do have a few episodes ready to go, but a week from today, our episode will be about Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Zelda in general. And I don't want to spoil too much about the specifics, but in order to tease it, we're going to kind of look at Zelda's influence on modern games and how ubiquitous it really is and how we seldom realize how much of an impact Ocarina and the original Zelda had on games at large. But also how Breath of the Wild, I think, is a pretty important game in the series.
I think that's about all of the questions and comments I found. There weren't a lot of questions, to be honest. It was mostly comments, which is cool, but it's easier for us to respond to questions rather than comments. But still, those of you that did contribute, even those of you who just left in the comments, like, great work, that does mean a lot, especially something like this, which, since it's not sponsored, it is entirely dependent on you guys. So if you guys like it, if you guys watch it, if you guys share it, then we can keep doing stuff like this.
Yeah, we really want to keep going with it and keep the bi-weekly schedule going. And again, we already have things planned and ready to publish, but we do need your input, because this is actually what you're watching now is what sets this show apart from like things like Danny O'Dwyer used to do. That's a huge inspiration on us, but we want to kind of do our own thing as well, and we want to have your input and start a conversation, like I mentioned. And we really appreciate you sending in your thoughts on Twitter, on YouTube, and keep doing so. And we are really excited to keep going forward with Reboot. We're off to a good start. We feel good about it, and we are so glad that you guys all joined us. So we'll see you next week with his Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild.